So we're going to have a little discussion about some of the issues as they relate to working overseas. And it's often said that in modern wars, it's more dangerous to be a woman than it is a soldier. To what extent, I'll start with you, Lindsay, to what extent is that true?
I actually don't believe that. I think it's one of the few reasons I'm alive is because I'm a woman. I think that I work mostly in the Muslim world and in the Middle East, and I think I'm often treated sort of more respectfully, and people invite me into their homes. I have access to families and women and children. Both times I've been kidnapped, of course, I was groped, but I was not beaten as excessively as the men. I think on the front line, you can't say whether it's safer to be a woman, because on the front line, we're all getting shot at. So I think it just really, you know, I think it just depends. For me, I've always felt sort of safer because I'm a woman.
Now, what about when you turn the equation and you talk about the refugees, the women who are living in the war zones and subject to, you know, what's going on?
I think everyone's subject to what's going on. I think, you know, the men are often tortured or beaten, and women are sexually assaulted. And so, you know, trauma is trauma. You can't really quantify which is worse, you know. I think the whole time, for example, in Libya, when we were being held captive and I was being groped, I was crying, I could hear my colleagues being smashed on the back of the head with guns. And so for me, I thought, God, I feel so bad, they're getting beaten, and they felt bad because they could only imagine what was happening to me. And I think you can't really say what's worse. I think everyone is a victim of war, every single civilian casualty, every woman, every child, every man, and it's just a matter of, you know, if you're not a combatant, you suffer.
And Laura, you see it through the eyes of being a humanitarian and traveling the world in conflict zones.
I think, look, I completely agree with Lindsay that men are killed and women are killed, and war is terrible for everyone. I think that quote was originally said by the deputy commander in Congo in 2008, 10 years ago. And I think what's changed is that we used to be used to war being something that happened between armies on battlegrounds. And now conflict and war is in our communities, it's in our homes. And women's very bodies are being used as battlegrounds. We saw that in Bosnia, where 20,000 women were put in rape camps. And the Bosnian people were torn apart by attempting to divide through rape. We saw that in Rwanda, 500,000 women killed in 100 days. This is a deliberate attempt to wipe out a people, to destroy their ethnicity and their culture and their community. And in Congo, it's not just the rape that happens by the militants. No. 57% of women in Congo are raped, according to a 2011 study. Violence becomes normalized. It becomes something that is every day.
And in South Sudan.
In South Sudan. And so I think that what's changed is that we see women as being subjected to violence in a way that we didn't experience in the past. And so that changes some of the solutions. And one of the problems and one of the reasons that the work is so important to be directed towards women is that we're not used to thinking that you need particular solutions for women out of this kind of conflict and war.
But there's no shortage. Your images show you there's no shortage of places where it's happening. So what's the way forward? We look at these images and we're horrified, and we feel compelled to, you know, to do something. What's the way forward?
Well, I think, you know, we all are here because we believe that investing in women is a way to bring about change. But one of the images that comes to mind is, you know, when you're on a plane and you're told to put on your own oxygen mask before you go to help someone else. I think it's really important that in these situations we invest in women so that they can heal and they can also help heal others. So for Women, it's about giving women who survive these incredible atrocities the resources and the skills and the knowledge, and also connections to support. When you've had your life devastated, you've lost family members, you've been torn from your home, rebuilding community, having connection is an absolutely critical part of healing.
And women are also incredibly, a lot of these programs to help women get back into society, microfinancing, all of the trauma therapy, that helps the whole community, because women are often very responsible about how they do that and very dedicated. And so it is very important to address the women and try and help them.
What extent in your travels have you've seen humanitarian groups and the work of people making change on the ground?
I work with them all the time. A lot of my I depend on humanitarian groups to access certain things, because as a photographer who covers conflict, one of the hardest things is accessing a situation. You know, often these villages are very remote. You know, we also want to do it in a way that's careful. We don't want to re-traumatize people who have been traumatized, so we work within the community of aid workers who have already sort of assessed different women or different men, depending on what the story is, and they help identify people. They help us be sensitive about the way we do interviews and the way we photograph, and so that's very important, because you certainly, when we leave as journalists, we leave behind the entire community and they stay there. So it's very important to understand the group and the people that we're going in to cover. And so we're very dependent on organizations like Women for Women.
I know you've dealt with this, all journalists deal with this. People are horrified that we tend to run to things that others are fleeing, and the question inevitably comes up, why do you do it? Why do you do it as a humanitarian? Why do you do it as a journalist? Put yourself in these situations where you can be kidnapped or killed.
Well, I'll start. I mean, I was in Congo 2 weeks ago, and during the same week that a friend of mine who's a journalist showed the incredible conflict that's happening now that has led to 70,000 women, people leaving Congo just this year. That's on top of the 4.5 million people who are displaced. So it's a place that's in active conflict. But why do you go into a situation like that? In my case, it's because of the women we serve. Some of you who've been with Women for Women International have heard the story of Anurata, one of our trainers. I had the privilege of meeting her the week before last. She, like me, got a degree in education, and she was teaching in a secondary school. But the Interahamwe came across the border, they kidnapped her, they kept her as a sex slave, they took her away from her husband and her child. And then she managed to escape after a year, but then a different militia group attacked her. And her landlord kicked her out. I can't even believe. But I meet her, and she's joined Women for Women as a trainer. 2,000 women have gone through, she's trained them. I saw her training, and you can just imagine for women to see somebody who's had these experiences and hasn't overcome them and is now helping them. And she has the most incredible calm and wisdom. And you know this from people in your own lives. When people are at the front lines of life, whether it's facing something difficult here or there, you've got to learn how to deal with it. And the most incredible part of the human spirit comes out. And so, and frankly, it's the conflict. It's also, you know, leaving your house and family to go do this work. But once you meet someone like Anurata, or know that every time you do this work, thousands of more women like Anurata can be helped, it just makes you say it's worth it. They are on the front lines facing death and displacement and hunger every single day. It's my privilege to be able to try to help.
And Lindsay, what drives you forward? I mean, obviously, these photographs elicit such an important reaction. Is that part of it, or what?
Yeah, I mean, I want you all to care. I want you all to see what's happening. I want, you know, when we have, you know, when most of us are caught up in our daily lives and we don't have time to think about the rest of the world. But I want to take that picture that will sort of stop you, and you have to ask questions. What's going on here? What happened to this woman? You know, sometimes there are pictures that you would never even know it's something devastating, because I try to take it in a beautiful way, but it's a horrific subject. So I get your attention long enough to get you to ask a question. And that's my goal, is to get you to care about all of these issues, because they keep happening. And it's a lot easier to ignore them than to care about them. So I want you to care.
Okay. We've got some questions that came in via social media. The first one is, some would argue that with all the human rights issues we're facing here in the United States, we should prioritize our own problems. How would you respond to that? There's obviously there's no shortage of suffering in the world.
I mean, I'm working a lot in America right now, because I agree 100%. I think I've spent 23 years working overseas, and it seems like a very good time to be working in America. So I'm working a lot here now on a lot of the same issues, ironically, I've covered overseas. They're right here.
Yeah. And I agree too, but I absolutely don't think we have to make a choice. There's absolutely no reason why we can't be active here locally and internationally. We are all one part of one humanity. And And I think, you know, it's often the same people who argue against international aid and development who wouldn't necessarily believe in investing in social services here either. And I think when that is happening, it's up to people like us to stand up and to reach out and to invest.
Another question from social media. Foreign policies fueled by xenophobia continue to make it difficult for refugees to find safety. How can we change public opinion about refugees? And I relate that question acknowledging it's somewhat politically charged, but it's a fascinating question.
Well, can I answer first?
Yeah.
By watching Lindsay's photography. Seriously, when you see that image, can you not just say, that person is a person just like me? And it's absolutely ridiculous that we're not helping them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to humanize. I'm trying to make you realize that they're not refugees. They're women, they're children, they're people exactly like us. They have the same goals, the same desires to provide their children for a safe life, an education. They have the same dreams that we have. And it just so happens there's a war in their country and they have to flee. You know, how can you turn your back on them? And so for me as a photographer, I want to show that. I want to show really intimate scenes so that you can relate to them on a more personal level.
I think sometimes the notion is they have a choice. In many of these cases, they have no choice.
No,
they've
many
got
of these
to run.
cases, they have no choice.
Yeah.
No, and I think everyone here, I don't know how social media savvy we all are, but the reason we have the hashtag Match Her Courage is that we think we can all play a role in sharing the stories, the powerful images we've seen, and the stories that we have the privilege to collect from the women we serve, and sharing them onward, and being connected to women directly overseas allows us to have that link that Lindsay does so powerfully in her photography.
Okay. The next one, as we've seen in Bosnia and Rwanda, it takes a long time after violent conflict ends to rebuild society. What are some of the obstacles women face in post-conflict countries? Which is an interesting question because we often are there at the height of it, but as you know, we move on.
Look, I think one of the things is that the kind of conflict that we've seen and the kind of genocide that we've experienced in places like Rwanda and with the Yazidis in Bosnia, that doesn't go away overnight. And so it's a really important long-term healing. And one of the things that's different about Women for Women International is that Women for Women stays, not just in the immediate conflict, but over the long term. So we are still working through a partner in Bosnia. We're still working through a partner in Kosovo. And we are now transitioning in Rwanda to say we have to continue the work. There's still a great deal of poverty and conflict that's to overcome. But there is a government now in place that you can work with. And so the work changes, and the work changes to investing in civil society, creating partnerships with government, because you have to rebuild the economy, you have to rebuild society, and you have to rebuild trust. So for example, in Bosnia, we're working with young women, bringing young women together across divides, a whole new generation, to say, let's heal, let's rebuild this country.
And Lindsay talks about awareness. Is it hard, though, creating awareness in a place that seems so far, a conflict that seems so far in our rearview mirror, that the notion that these are still areas in as deep a need in many ways?
Absolutely. I mean, even Congo, where, as I said, there's 4.5 million people displaced and 7.5 million people not having enough food right now. It's a conflict that's live, and yet it's hard to get attention. And so that's why we work so closely with both of you and are so absolutely grateful for the work that journalists do to help try to bring attention to the fact that these are problems that are still there to do, but also that we can make a difference and to tell the stories of how we have been able to make a difference.
But there are problems like what happens after a country, after the war ends. There's trauma, the infrastructure is broken, there are no medical facilities. A woman, a lot of the maternal health issues are in countries where, they've been at war or they are at war, and so they can't access facilities. The doctors have fled. There aren't, most people, they train to get their medical degree and they leave because they see no future. So those are some of the residual effects of war. So that's important to talk about that.
Yeah, and Lindsay, I'm curious, watching your work there and the young woman in Myanmar who you followed up on, how much of this do you take with you personally? I mean, obviously, it's, how do you not?
I take it all.
Yeah, right?
I believe, I don't want to forget people's stories because I feel like it's a tribute to them and the fact that they've opened their lives not only to me, but all the readers of the publications I work for. And so you know, I am a very emotional person. I'm also a very serious person when I'm working, and I like to have fun when I'm not working. So I try to have that balance. I try to talk about the things that I see often, because I think it's important to talk about things. But you know, I think spontaneously I'll break down and cry, and maybe that's because I'm carrying a lot with me. I mean, I think I try to be honest about it. I don't, you know, yeah.
Okay. Well, we have time for one more question, and this kind of brings us back to where we started, which is important. The question is, women refugees face higher rates of forced marriage, gender-based violence, and sexual abuse. What can be done to help them? And I think that's really the question that's driving this discussion.
Well, the particular approach that Women for Women International takes is this combination of working with the whole woman, making sure that you're engaging in psychosocial support for the healing of the trauma. And another really important part is connecting to other women for support. Because you've been torn from your community and your family, and as you were just saying, you know, Syrians in particular, all people, but many of the communities we work with, being with other people is so critically important. And now you're with nobody, you know no one. So to put women into groups of 25 where they meet weekly and get to know each other and build up trust in this strange place where you don't speak the language and you're afraid to go out on the street and you've lost family members and you've lost your livelihoods and you don't know what the future is going to hold. To provide a routine and an ability to come together is critically important. One of the things that we have to realize is that, as Lindsay showed, many refugees are not actually in refugee camps. Our image is in a camp. But for example, in Jordan, where we're opening up a program, if we can generate the support this year, we've realized that the majority of refugees are living in host communities. And what happens when refugees come into host communities? The ones that welcome are most often the poorest. And so then you start to build pressure on the economic system there too. And it's really, really important to serve the host community as well as the refugees. Otherwise, you lead to tensions. So if refugees are going to be welcomed, you need to take a holistic approach. So that's part of what I think we at Women for Women try to do in our work with refugees.
And I think we need, you know, when we talk about women who have survived gender-based violence and the things that happen in war, we also have to engage the men. I mean, the men are, in many of these countries, the ones who disown their wives when they come back after having been assaulted. And so I think education is key, and engaging the men. It's not only about women, as much as we love women.
If I could just end with one anecdote on men's engagement. We have a men's engagement program that was started in 2002. And over 20,000 men have gone through that program.
It's amazing.
And I have some fantastic stories, but I'll just leave you with one, my favorite quote, with a man who went through our program and said, "I am so relieved that you've taught me that the Quran does not say that I have to beat my wife. I hated beating my wife. And I'm so relieved I don't feel I have to do it anymore."
Well, Lindsay and Lori, thank you very much. It's a great discussion. I admire both of you and your work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here.